Greetings, Bazalwane. I'm excited to take you through day 195 of our daily Bible reading plan. And today we'll be discussing the book of Proverbs, chapter 4, 5, and 6. Now, the book of Proverbs is one of the 3 wisdom books in the Bible, alongside the book of Job and the book of Ecclesiastes. Now, the book of Proverbs, most of these proverbs are attributed to King Solomon, who in 1 Kings chapter 4 was said to have written a lot of proverbs. This book is divided into 3 sessions. The first one, from chapter 1 to chapter 9, focuses on the father to son advice. The second part, which is from chapter 10 up until chapter 29, focuses on the Proverbs. And the conclusion of the book is chapters 30 and 31, which are made of poems for Agar and Lemuel. That's where we find the proverb about the Proverbs 31 woman. Today we'll be focusing on chapters 4, 5, and 6. Now, the book of Proverbs is the holy grail of wisdom. And from chapters 1 to chapter 9, here we are talking about the quintessential father to son advice. It is what you would expect to get from a wise father to a son. So let's find out what this advice is all about. Starting with chapter 4. In chapter 4, we find that the father teaches generational wisdom to the son. This is the wisdom that has been passed on for ages from his father. It starts with a plea for the son to listen. And this plea is important because before you can get wisdom, you need to be able to listen. After the plea, the father goes on to encourage the son to get wisdom. And that's really the first wisdom, because if the son has the motivation to go on to get wisdom, that's how they can find other nuggets later. The father goes on to give the importance of getting wisdom. And this tells us that wisdom is not necessarily something that you have, but it's something that you must get. Second part of chapter 4 focuses on avoiding the path of the wicked or the foolish. And that's where we find one of the most famous verses in verse 23, which talks about guarding our hearts, because that's where everything flows from. And the book concludes with a plea to stay on the right path. Moving on to chapter 5, this is where we find a warning against sexual immorality, and issues such as adultery are tackled directly. The book starts with a warning or a message from the father to the son about the charm of an immoral woman. And the father explains the lure of that immoral woman by saying that their lips of an immoral woman drip honey, and her mouth is smooth like oil. There is such an attraction from this kind of woman. But the father goes on to talk about the dangers of associating with that kind of a woman. And it's the danger of those kind of entanglements or sexual immoralities. The second part of the book focuses on finding satisfaction from your own wife. And this is the advice that the father gives to say, you see, there are many rivers or wells that you can drink from outside, but that should not be the focus. You must derive and find pleasure in the woman of your youth. What an advice. Now, when we move on to the last verses of this chapter, it now focuses on the consequences of adultery, and they are very much detailed there, and I wish you go and read to find out for yourself. Moving on to Proverbs chapter 6, it starts with the father making a warning against the foolishness of taking other people's debts and how one can get out of such situation if you find yourself in it. I particularly love in this chapter verses 6 up to 8, which talks about the honor of hard work. And here is where we find the famous ant story, which talks about how ants gather food during the period where there is abundance or plenty, so that in the period of scarcity they have something to eat. Verses 12 to 15 focuses on the destiny of a wicked man, and from that it goes on to talks about the things that God hates, and these are the 7 things that God hates. I will not talk about all of them here, so I encourage you to go and read about those things that God hates. Just to go back a little bit, I loved how the father also warned against laziness and sleeping with no purpose instead of focusing on the work. Chapter 6 concludes again with the father going back to warn against adultery and brings back again the dangers of such sexual immoralities or entanglements that they can bring to our lives. Verse of the day, I take it from chapter 4 verse 5, which says, "Get wisdom, get understanding, do not forget my word, nor turn away from them." I particularly like this verse because it encourages us to look for wisdom. Thank you very much for listening and tuning in. I hope we continue with this discussion on our Zoom platform. May God bless you.